In this video, we're going to look at the media landscape in Canada. In Canada, our media is dominated by one public broadcaster, the CBC, and several large private media companies. We have a highly concentrated media sector, and it's more concentrated than other comparable countries, one of the highest media concentrations in the G7. And this applies to our print dailies, our newspapers, our broadcast outlets, which would include TV and radio, and then some digital outlets as well. This structure of our media ecosystem shapes how Canadians consume news, especially news about politics. When it comes to print, there are several large publications, the National Post, Globe and Mail, Toronto Star, and their respective parent companies. They tend to dominate print circulation. Not just print, but they have a web presence, digital presence for most of their issues as well. You will often find a mix of news reporting, so good quality reporting, but also some opinion and editorial content as well with these outlets. When it comes to broadcast, so television, radio, and of course web, we see again three large companies: Rogers, Bell Media, and then Corus, which is owned by the Shaw Group. Again, we see a mix of reporting and opinion here as well, but the takeaway: few large dominant firms. We also have a digital space where there's some digital only, or at least primarily digital outlets, and they tend to be pretty partisan. When we look at some of these outlets, they are primarily driven by opinion. And in fact, much of what they do is really activism disguised as news. They're sort of trying to cheer for their political team or a specific political party. They do tend to focus on divisive cultural topics as well. What in this landscape are Canadians consuming? Well, it's a mix of different things. When we consider all types of print, broadcast, and TV, we do see that Canadians have tendency to prefer the CBC above others. MSN News, CTV, Yahoo, Global are among the top there, Post Media as well. But one thing to notice, the red bars indicate Canadian-owned and the blue are foreign-owned entities. So despite what rules we might have and regulations that try to protect Canadian content, we do consume a lot of American media. If we look at just digital news, we see the CTV do quite well. Post Media, CNN number 2. But again, Post Media is largely foreign owned. And so we do have, even in the digital space, a high percentage of content being consumed from sources that are non-Canadian owned. So in terms of media consumption, it helps to know what you're reading and what you're watching. Reporting. News reporting has some certain characteristics. It has objective language. There are reporters that are assigned to cover stories. They verify those stories. They interview people. They confirm their sources. They look at primary documents. And in the story, in the reporting, you will find references to that. They will talk about how many people they interviewed, how many times they confirmed it, who they talked to. All of that is just news gathering, sending people out to interview people and look at primary documents. They have editors, they have publishers, they have legal analysts that review their work before it gets published. And you'll see this at places like Global News, the CBC, and the National Post, and the Globe and Mail. Many of those places also have opinion and editorial pieces that they publish as well. This is written in more persuasive language. It's trying to convince you that something is good or bad. And these are sometimes helpful commentary pieces to help us understand what's going on in the world or in the country. The language will be a little more subjective, again, because the author is trying to convince us that a thing happening in the news is good or bad. You might also be reading just plain old clickbait. And these are stories from primarily the digital outlets. They'll have a very different framing. The framing will be provocative. It won't have neutral, objective language. The language might be inflammatory, lots of owned, eviscerated, destroyed in the headline and in the story itself. They might reference the reporting of others. They might talk about how this was first reported elsewhere, and then they'll write their own opinion about it, but they don't do a lot of primary reporting themselves. Typically, these are designed for virality. They want lots of likes and lots of shares, and that's how they engage their readership. So know what you're looking at: reporting, opinion versus plain old clickbait. I like to ask the question, how does it make you feel? If it makes you feel excited, and if it makes you feel good, then that's probably why you're reading it. It's probably an example of selective approach. You're choosing the type of media that makes you feel good rather than actually trying to learn about the world and to be informed about current events. So just to recap, media landscape in Canada is highly concentrated. One public broadcaster, a handful of private outlets that dominate everything. Accusations of bias on a lot of different fronts, whether that be partisan or regional, or the fact that these media companies are owned by like a handful of families, and they tend to reflect sort of the interest of the corporate sector and the wealthy. What we read and what we encounter really depends on individual consumption habits. Ultimately, when you're consuming media, if you want to be a critical consumer of news, know what you're looking at. Know whether you're looking at reporting or editorial content or just plain old clickbait.